We have a sophomore in high school, so preparing for college tuition is top of mind, while maintaining a healthy savings is also important to us. This is where Monarch comes in. Set yourself up for financial success this year in 2026. Monarch is the all-in-one personal finance tool designed to make your life easier. It brings your entire financial life, budgeting, accounts and investments, net worth, and future planning together in one dashboard on your phone or laptop. Feel aware and in control of your finances this year and get 50% off your Monarch subscription with code OFFTHECLOCK. In just a few minutes, my husband and I set up our Monarch and could instantaneously see our spending patterns. With automated tracking and clear projections, we can see now how to reach our financial goals of saving for college and building up our savings account. I love how Monarch keeps you focused on planning ahead and hitting financial milestones. Set yourself up for financial success in 2026 with Monarch, the all-in-one tool that makes proactive money management simple all year long. Use code OFFTHECLOCK at monarch.com for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code OFFTHECLOCK.
So fawning is a relational trauma response. So what most of us are familiar with is fight, flight, and freeze. But fawning tends to come online when those survival mechanisms either are unavailable or would make things worse. When we're talking about fawning, we're talking about a nervous system response. It's hardwired. It comes online without our conscious consent. This is not a choice. The body chooses the response that will keep us as safe as possible in a nanosecond. And what happens over time is that the fawn response is almost this protector 10 steps ahead of you all the time, no matter the context. And the body loses its ability to discern between discomfort and danger.
That was Ingrid Clayton on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode for our co-host discussion of today's interview. My guest today, Dr. Ingrid Clayton, is a licensed clinical psychologist with a master's in transpersonal psychology and a PhD in clinical psychology. She's had a thriving practice for more than 16 years and is a regular contributor to Psychology Today, where her blog, Emotional Sobriety, has had more than 1 million views. She lives in Los Angeles, California. And today we're going to talk about her book, which is called Fawning, Why the Need to Please Makes Us Lose Ourselves and How to Find Our Way Back. Ingrid, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on Psychologists Off the Clock today.
Thank you for having me, Debbie.
Well, we have lots to talk about, but I want to just start by laying the groundwork for our conversation with some of the basics, just for people who might not be familiar with fawning, although I find it's getting more out there in the popular culture. But for a lot of people, it's still pretty unfamiliar.
Even in the mental health field, right? Like
That's right.
We're getting up to speed. So yes, so fawning is a relational trauma response. So what most of us are familiar with is fight, flight, and freeze. But fawning tends to come online when those survival mechanisms either are unavailable or would make things worse. And so you think about relational trauma, often we're talking about childhood trauma or even well, I'll just say, you think about childhood trauma, for example, a child can't really fight back against their caregivers, right? It's going to make things worse. Similarly, the flight response, where are they going to run? They're going to be brought right back to the scene of the crime. So fawning then essentially is connection, is protection. And it has us leaning in to the very relationships that might be causing us harm. So depending on the context, that can look differently, but that includes caretaking, appeasement, flirting or flattering. So that's the basic.
Yeah. That's like such a great nutshell. And I really appreciate you putting it into context. I think one of my favorite things about your work is that it's so non-pathologizing. So instead of looking at us like, well, something's wrong with you, you need to just be more assertive and set boundaries. This is a behavior that's learned, that makes sense, that is protective. It's a survival mechanism. So could you just say a little bit more about that stance? Like, how is it protective and adaptive?
It is my favorite thing about this lens and language of fawning as a trauma response, is that it flips all of that old shaming and blaming rhetoric on its head. I don't know about you and your practice, but certainly in my personal life and my practice, I've just had so many people who've heard about codependency or have heard about people pleasing. These are the ways that we've historically talked about these behaviors. And they're like, I don't think I have a self-esteem problem. Or they oversimplify, like, well, just set some healthy boundaries. It seems so obvious. But when we're talking about fawning, we're talking about a nervous system response. It's hardwired. It comes online without our conscious consent. This is not a choice. The body chooses the response that will keep us as safe as possible in a nanosecond. So as a lifetime fawner myself, I can say that I did not turn to fawning because I did not love myself. I turned to fawning because I love myself so much. My body was willing to do whatever it took, moment to moment, to keep myself as relationally safe as possible. And then I say, right? So we honor the origins. We honor these life-saving adaptive origins. And let's face it, it's conditioned, it's expected, it's taught in so many different contexts. And although I'm grateful for the fawn response, we are also not meant to live in a survival response 24/7, which is unfortunately what happens for a lot of us, because relational trauma is ongoing trauma. It's day in, day out. It's cuts to your psyche from breakfast to bedtime. And what happens over time is that the fawn response is almost this protector 10 steps ahead of you all the time, no matter the context. And the body loses its ability to discern between discomfort and danger. So now we're fawning when there's no danger present. And the undercurrent of all of the symptoms of fawning is this self-abandonment, right? Because now I can't really know what I'm experiencing or feeling or needing, because my entire sense of safety is oriented outside my body. It's, are you okay with me? Are you mad at me? Do you validate me? Do you give me permission? Are you okay? Then and only then am I allowed to take up space, which makes sense, but you can see how it also fosters this experience where I don't even exist in the equation.
Right. So even though it's there for a reason, it's a survival mechanism, it has that adaptive quality to it. The cost of it is very high.
That's right. Both things are true. And it really highlights the context, which I think is the other thing that has gone missing in the conversation for so long, as though these people-pleasing tendencies just originated out of thin air for no reason. You know, we like this idea that everything is very individualized, and if you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and work hard enough, right, you'll sort of overcome. And I tried all the things. I'm here to say that I took all that direction. There's a reason I have all these degrees in psychology and then some. And none of it resolved my trauma. None of it resolved a chronic fawn response, in part because these things are contextual. I was responding, my body was responding to these dysfunctional environments that I was still living in. So it's like, speaking to veterans who are still in active combat and being like, why aren't you all better now? Why are you acting as though this is still threatening? Well, because it is.
And I think that contextual piece is so important. That's definitely a theme in our podcast, is looking at those contextual factors. And I think you alluded to some of the familial contexts, like childhood trauma, sort of these, and maybe you could say a few more about both familial contexts in which fawning is reinforced and learned and likely to occur, but also, cultural and societal structures and those kind of influences as well.
I think oftentimes fawning gets couched as a primarily female response. And so it's important to talk about that. It's not a gendered response specifically. And girls for a long time have been taught to fawn. And you think about it even in terms of boys who, I hate this saying, but it's this man up idea, right? Have a voice, rough and tumble, that's allowed. In other words, they were taught to lean towards a healthy fight response. And we were taught to lean towards fawn, smile, be grateful, caretake, say go kiss the creepy uncle, even though you don't want to, abandon your body and do what's good for the greater group, So I have yet to meet a woman who hasn't had at least one experience of the fawn response in her lifetime. And then you can extend that to all marginalized people. We live in so many different systems of power. And I've talked to people of color who say code switching falls into this fawning behavior. Neurodivergent people, masking, that's an aspect of the fawn response, right? You have to shapeshift to the mainstream culture in order to fit in, to stay safe. And the reality is that our bodies know where we reside in the pecking order. We know what we need to do to maintain these vital relationships, these vital structures of our lives. It might be a religious community. It might be, your neighborhood, your job. It can come up in all sorts of contexts where God, I cannot be my full self here. It is not safe. There will be consequences. And I think that's the other piece that's important to name. Fawning comes out when we are in a bind. We can either choose, authenticity. We talk about it like it's just available to all. Authenticity is a deeply privileged thing. And we can either choose radical authenticity and honesty or safety. And, our bodies are hardwired for survival. They will choose safety just about 100% of the time.
Yeah. And I think that what you're speaking to has to do with power differentials. And
That's right.
I kept thinking about the example you give in the book of the actor and podcaster Dax Shepard and how he talked on his podcast about, he's this 6'2" white male, powerful. And he was like, oh, I'm able to overcome fawning. And it's like, well, that's a privilege, right? For you.
That's a deep privilege. Yes, he was interviewing Anna Kendrick for her movie, Woman of the Hour, which is essentially an incredible movie about fawning because it's all about the women. It's about every woman in that movie was fawning. And she's curious with Dax, like, what was your go-to trauma response? Are you always a fight guy? And he said, no. And what was powerful too, is that he immediately recalled an experience in his own childhood where this guy was coming for him out of left field and his body just shifted like, no, dude, you're cool. I'd never say that or do that. Right. It was deep flattery and appeasement. And then he went on to say, it still touches me now. I'm so grateful I got big enough and strong enough to grow out of the need for fawning. And I thought, oh my gosh, how many of us will never grow out of it? He was talking to two women, his co-host and Anna in the moment, both women, both petite. Monica herself is a woman of color. We don't have that option. And so naming the systems of power becomes vital to reduce the shame. And I don't know about you, but if I want to find some change and freedom from anything, I've got to get shame out of the way. And so even just this education, I think it lowers that experience of shame where we're going, yes, I make sense. My body makes sense. I'm not broken.
That is the part that is so helpful about your approach, is that shame is so baked into it, but instead of exacerbating the shame, you're almost like shining a light on it as part of the equation here, right? Like people are often carrying deep shame, and to even take that step of acknowledging that can be a huge step forward.
I think it's so important, with childhood trauma too. We can't make our caregivers the bad guy. We literally need them to survive. So the body will just say, whoop, it must be me. I must be deficient here. And that's part of the motor that keeps the fawn response going of how can I be better? How can I be more, funny or a perfectionist or please them in some other way? And if we don't untangle those pieces, we're really keeping people stuck.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the book, you give so many examples. You use yourself very openly as an example, which I truly appreciated, your openness. You write about some of your clients who have talked to you about fawning. Can you give us some examples? Because there's such a range of behaviors of what this might look like. Just, some kind of to illustrate some of these patterns that people might be able to see themselves in, or perhaps someone they know.
Yeah, I think what is a pretty common experience for myself too, but with my clients, is first this idea that we're talking about a trauma response. Well, that means I must have some experience of trauma. And none of my clients came into my office naming that they had an experience of trauma. In fact, they bristled at the word. Oh, that's so overdone, and everybody has trauma. And I think it becomes important to really educate people then on what complex trauma is, or relational trauma, that it often does not look like these specific acute events, these obvious markers in time where there was a before, a during, and an after. Relational trauma tends to be, it's like the water that you're swimming in. There might not be a before experience, especially if you're talking about childhood trauma. It can be pervasive experiences of, emotionally immature caregivers, or neglect, or chronic invalidation. It's these kind of cuts to your psyche over and over and over. And yet for a lot of people, they go, well, but I wasn't, fill in the blank to the measuring stick that they have of other people's experience. So first, I think we have to do this job of really educating people that this lens and language is available to you if you identify with the symptoms. Trauma is not defined by the events themselves. Trauma is defined by how your particular experiences overwhelmed and shaped your nervous system. So that's the sort of point of entry to talking about these things. And then along those lines, the first client that I present in the book, his name is Anthony. Ingrid, I come from this great family, this intact family, and he held this narrative, which was primarily the narrative that was told to him over and over. We are a happy family, right? Like, you do not break that code. But he realized that now in his 50s, his entire life was shaped by wanting to please and finally be accepted by his parents, that he never, ever felt that he was. And so this entire life, although it looked very successful, Harvard, partner at this amazing law firm, great house, married son, he was not present in his own life. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know who he liked. He knew how to show up for other people. He did not know how to show up for himself. And so this moment of like, wow, that's a pretty big indicator that you're in your 50s and you have no idea who you are. You don't know what you like to do. You don't have any hobbies. And so pivoting from this lifetime of external validation back to who am I? What am I experiencing even right now? How do I feel? Can I honor that? Growing this sense of self and internal safety sort of from the bottom up for the first time. I think his story was so powerful in terms of what he was able to, I want to say reclaim, but it's really claiming for the first time his personality and his interests.
So in his case, a lot of self-sacrificing, a lot of just putting other people's needs first, trying to get that extrinsic validation.
100%.
And it's subtle.
Yes.
In his case, I think it may not necessarily be so overt. It's just this lifelong pattern of bending to other people first.
Yes. And I think it can look honestly like success. It can look like meeting expectations. I can identify with that to a degree, right? I went and sort of did all of the things that made me feel like maybe I would rise above and finally feel okay. And yet none of those external markers, I know a lot of us can relate to this, none of those external things changed my internal experience, this deep disconnect from self. So that's one example. But I think there's, people have a history of relationships that don't feel reciprocal. They're always the ones that are showing up in caretaking and feeling like they're being dropped or left behind or not really seen. There's a lot of abusive relationships. I can speak to my own personal experience here that my nervous system was developed really in a context of emotional abuse and exploitation. And so if you boil that down, what you see is that I felt safest. My body found a way to feel safe in these contexts. So in other words, I almost felt safest in those conditions. So then what, of course, felt safest to me after I moved away hundreds and then thousands of miles and even years down the line, my body was still patterned to feel safest in those environments. It's almost like the feeling of unavailability or exploitation. It almost turned on this sense in my body that was like, oh, that's my power. I know how to manage these situations. So this is how you can see how our trauma ends up reenacted over and over by these pervasive trauma responses if we don't understand that that's what it is. And I just thought that was my chemistry. I just thought, I was like, why can't I be attracted to a healthy, available person? And I was couching my chemistry in what was, quite frankly, trauma reenactment, which I know is also very common. So there's a history of, unhealthy relationships. It feels like you can't break that cycle. We tend to be terrified of conflict. I mean, it's a real example for me that I could not unsubscribe from email lists that I never subscribed to because I was so worried that the sender was going to find out and I was going to hurt their feelings. I mean, the level
I loved that example because it's such a day-to-day thing, but it's like just imagining that, well, what if I hurt their feelings if I unsubscribe?
It's real, and it always feels like the stakes are high. So I think that's the other indicator that we're talking about a trauma response here, because it can feel like something so small and so simple as life or death. And I know now for me, and this is true for a lot of my clients too, that I share their experience, to go back to that idea that we tell people, well, just have a voice. And why didn't you tell someone about it? And as though these things are so available. And the reality is I did tell people about it. So did a lot of my clients. And we had that classic experience that it made it worse.
Yes.
So conflict, in other words, having a voice, setting boundaries, I felt more annihilated in my experience of trying to take care of myself than I felt by the original abuses. So that's what we say when we say the body remembers. And now, even in this day-to-day, I can't even unsubscribe from an email because it dips into that same old feeling of I'm not allowed to have a voice. It's going to make it worse.
I just want to take a moment to honor what you shared in the book about how maybe that layer of people not taking your side, not standing up for you, not believing you was so deeply hurtful and painful. That was just heartbreaking to read. People who should have been there to protect you weren't.
Yes. I think the saddest thing for me is how universal of an experience that is. I really felt for so long that there were unique aspects to my story. And now having, written a memoir and now this book, Fawning, the emails and the messages I'm telling a very universal story. And to me, that's the most heartbreaking thing, is that we weren't protected. And so when you're not protected, when your body knows I'm all alone out here, right? This notion of unconditional relationships and love, that must be for other people. I've got to figure this out by myself. There's also this hyper independence. We don't want to let anyone in because no one was there when we needed them. So you can see this like constellation of all of these things collectively over time. It starts to really harden into what can feel like, well, this is just my personality. This is just the way things are, which is the other reason why I think teaching through lived experience and that kind of storytelling can be so helpful, because theory can just feel like, well, I don't know if that applies to me. But when you know, whether it's my story or 7 of my clients who've gifted me with their real and deep experience, people really see themselves reflected on the page and they go, oh, that's what this is. I know what she's talking about. You know, it's over and over. I get this message of, have you been reading my diary? Like there's these deep experiences that people have been holding in isolation, thinking they're the only one. And, you know, it's heartbreaking, but it's also so hopeful that we are not alone.
Right. Common humanity. You're not alone.
That's right.
Yeah. You're not broken. This is not your fault. Right.
That's right.
When you're running a podcast or a business, one of the first things you learn is that you can't do everything by yourself. You need reliable partners to support you. For this podcast, it's the amazing Jadine who has our back no matter what. And for your business selling products online, it's Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Mattel and Heinz, 2 staples in my household for sure, to brands just getting started. Best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. What if people haven't heard about my brand, you ask? Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/POTC. Go to shopify.com/POTC. That's shopify.com/POTC.
As a psychologist, I can tell you that regular workouts are good for mental health. What the research doesn't specify is whether those workouts need to happen in cute outfits, but I'm choosing to interpret the data liberally. Of course, buying new gear all the time isn't realistic, but becoming a Fabletics VIP makes it easier. When I signed up as a new VIP with Fabletics, I got 80% off everything, which my therapist side knows is probably activating my reward circuitry, but my runner side doesn't care. The fit's great, the leggings keep their shape, the jackets are warm without being bulky, basically everything you need to avoid the I should turn back thoughts at mile 2. My favorite new pieces are the lightweight adventure jacket and the power hold compression leggings, which are perfect for those chilly morning runs. This membership also gives you access to Fabletics scrubs. They just launched a collab with Nurse John this month, and if you work in healthcare or know someone who does, new VIPs can get a full scrub set for just $15. The scrubs are made with durable water-repellent fabric, so spills just roll right off and feel far more breathable and flexible than premium scrubs without the premium price tag. It's the same activewear quality, just built for long days on your feet. Fabletics already has incredible deals, and I've got an exclusive offer just for my listeners. Get 80% off everything when you sign up as a VIP. Just head to fabletics.com/POTC, take a quick style quiz, and be sure to select POTC when prompted to unlock your 80% off. That's fabletics.com/POTC.
Well, talk to me more about the hypervigilance and anxiety part of the fawning, especially when it's like a chronic fawning response.
Well, again, that idea that all of our safety resides outside of our body. So guess where our focus lies? We are the ones that can sense someone's mood before they even can. You know, we hear the jingle of the keys in the door and we know how that person's feeling on the other side of it. I mean, honestly, this is a part of, I think, to the degree that I'm a decent therapist, this has contributed to that because my nervous system is so primed to read yours. Mm-hmm. The second that a client logs on, they might go hi and sound like they normally do, but I know when there's something underneath it, right? So there is this hyper attunement to the external environment. And what's interesting about that is most of my clients don't recognize that hypervigilance is a form of anxiety. They don't feel anxious. Well, they don't feel anxious because they're not attuned to their own body.
Yeah.
So when we start to practice that, okay, tell me what you're noticing now. What are you aware of in your body? This becomes the building blocks for like, oh, well, I have this knot in my stomach, or I feel this fluttering. They start to recognize, or this gripping, whatever it is, they start to recognize their own symptoms of anxiety for the first time. It's similar. It reminds me of, in relationships when I talk about this idea of just this pattern of relationships that feel abusive or unavailable, non-reciprocal in one way. We feel like we as fawners are so available because we're so available to the other person. And we recognize the other person's unavailability. So we're going, well, if they would just, go to therapy, or we start solving all of their problems in these various ways. But the reality is we are unavailable to ourselves. And that's an aspect of that anxiety piece. But we don't know it, again, because we're not even attuned enough to notice that we're not connected to our own body. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I've seen so many examples of that as a therapist as well, where the person is they're just monitoring the other person all the time. They're trying to manage that. And they're just so disconnected from their experience. It has an emotional avoidance quality to it.
Yes.
Often. They're just not even, they can't label their feelings. They can't really notice them, hold them with awareness. So I know exactly what you mean. And actually, this always makes me think of, did you read Jeanette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mother Died? This example where her mother stepped in water and she was hypervigilant trying to make sure that didn't happen because she could see the whole chain. I don't know if you remember this in the book. She could see, well, then she's going to need new pantyhose, and then we're going to be late for church, and then she's going to yell at all of us. And she was so attuned to her mom, she could see the whole thing play out in advance and try to keep that from happening. And so anyway, people are so on eggshells about the other person that they're nowhere to be found in all of this.
And I think what that looks like to an outsider can often be this emotional immaturity. And it can be talked about that way. And it's true. But I think when we just hear that language, we get defensive and we sort of bristle. Like, what do you mean, right? We feel so developed because people around us are so underdeveloped and we're doing so much caretaking around them. But we have not had the opportunity to learn how we feel, how to regulate those feelings. We come by it honestly, in other words. And so part of healing then is this real developmental process that was missed, this growing up, this ability to not only notice, but name, hold our feelings, know that they have a beginning and a middle and an end. These are processes that a lot of us weren't afforded because we were responsible for everybody else.
So there's one more thing I want to get to before we dive more into the unfawning process, because there's a lot to talk about there too. But this was actually something I thought was fascinating because I had never thought about it before, which is the relationship between fawning and honesty and lying. Because I think in a certain sense, when people are doing that shape-shifting or conforming to the needs of others, they are staying quiet, right? They're kind of there's like a lie of omission going on almost, where they're not speaking their whole truth. But you have a very compassionate framework toward that behavior. So I was just really interested in that section of the book.
It's so common. I've seen it so many times. And honestly, it's often one of the most deeply shameful experiences for people to talk about because it's couched as you're a liar. Lying is a bad thing. You're a bad person. Again, there's just so much shame. And in my experience and working with my clients, to your point, you set it out sort of just right, which is in order to keep yourself safe out of the gates, there's often this, lying by omission. I can't be all of me. But what also tends to happen is more overt dishonesty. We say things, even like Dax Shepard, like, no, we're cool, I love you, or whatever he was saying, right? Those were all lies. It was just this week, actually, a novelist called me to talk about this very thing because her main character is a fawner who's lying. And she doesn't want to do sort of a cartoonish caricature of that experience. She really wanted to paint this as a whole person. And what we kept coming back to is You have to stop focusing on the lie, and you have to focus on the need that's being met. There is a very real vital need. This feels similar to the other things we've been talking about, whether it was anxiety or emotional maturity or feeling available to yourself. Lying is similar. We're not even seeing ourselves enough to know that it's technically a lie. We don't exist. Our body is moving throughout the world in a way that's only interested in what does the environment need of me. And it shape shifts automatically. These aren't choices. And one of the, I think, most powerful experiences that I talk about in my book is a client that I've worked with for a long time. But when I first met her, she introduced herself as a heroin addict, and she was in recovery and she was sober and clean. And one day she came in and she said, "I have to tell you something." Gosh, it still makes me emotional when I think about it now. She was terrified. And she told me, "I'm not a heroin addict." But she came from such abuse, from such physical and sexual abuse that was never taken seriously. She came from an experience where she was smoking pot 24/7 in order to cope. And this led to rehab when she was very, very young. And everyone in rehab was like, weed, right? So once again, she's not being taken seriously. So at some point in time, it wasn't a conscious choice. Her body got the message. Oh, the one thing that's being taken seriously is if I'm a heroin addict. And so it became her story for her needs to be met. She did not set out to lie. She set out to save her own life. And then somewhere along the way, now she has this great shame because she knows that this isn't true. And she has to reveal this sitting on my couch. And I felt it then. I feel it now. I'm so grateful that her body found a way to keep her as safe as it could in really, really unsafe environments. And even to where she found this community that was this incredibly helpful community for a time. And that she also came to a place, partially in my office, where she felt safe enough to unburden herself, even of the protector, because it wasn't as necessary anymore. We all have an experience of this. The things that maybe once kept us safe and were so vital, you go, it's not really keeping me safe anymore. It's keeping me stuck. And these pivot points become so huge. And I see that around this notion of lying all the time. And I think it's also common with complex trauma, because again, a lot of these wounds, they're invisible wounds. They're behind closed doors. No one else really sees it or gets it or validates it. And so oftentimes there is this need to craft a story that fits, that mirrors your internal experience more than what people are seeing and, quite frankly, dismissing.
No, it's true. And I think that example, it's like the extremes people go to be heard when nobody is listening to them, and they need to be heard and they need to get attention. And then what did you say about this pattern that used to keep me safe isn't working anymore? Then suddenly you realize this is just holding me back. It's keeping me stuck. It's keeping me from having really good relationships. And that leads us to this pivot toward unfawning, which I think is really the second half of your book. But it's once people get to the point where they're like, this is a really ingrained and inflexible pattern that is not working for me anymore, they have to learn a new way. So there's a lot to talk about there, and we won't have time to get to everything. So I will, of course, recommend your book for people who maybe see themselves in this pattern and want to learn more about this. But there are a couple things I really want to dive into, starting with this idea of learning to listen to ourselves and trust ourselves, because so often people are so out of touch with their own needs and preferences. And I think you've already given us a little hint of this, but what are some things people can do to start to reconnect? Like I've had clients, I'll say, what do you need in this situation or this relationship? And they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So what advice do you have?
It's a long road. My advice is to start small and intentionally. And I don't know about you, but every trauma training I've ever been to, we don't ask the question, what do you think about that? Right? We have lots of opinions and ideas, but what we're talking about is an embodied experience that needs an embodied solution. And so we use the language of, what are you noticing right now? It might be a body scan. It might be a feeling. It might be orienting through your senses. The senses are the language of the nervous system. So what do you notice? What do you see right now? Is there any place you'd like to let your eyes just linger for a moment? And typically when I invite people into this orienting framework, I watch them go, they take a spontaneous, deep breath. They're not efforting like, oh, we're going to do breath work now. Right? Still not embodied, but breathing real hard. Orienting through the senses allows us to be in present time and present place. It drops us into our body in a way where the body gets to feel more safe. Again, it's not theoretical. So things like resourcing through this orienting practice, or asking ourselves, what do I notice right now? And I love that answer, when you ask someone what they might need and they go, what do you mean what needs? Whatever they respond with is the right answer. And this is really important for fawners to hear, because boy, oh boy, even in therapy, do we want to please our therapists? Mm-hmm. We want to have the right answer. We go, what do they want me to say? Maybe I'll say that. And so if you feel nothing, if you feel numb, if you feel rage and irritation at the question itself, I beg of you, say that. Because this is the seed, the deep seed that becomes planted, where you are reconnecting with yourself in such a powerful, powerful way. And there is no right answer. The only right answer is the one that allows us to stay connected. Finally, once and for all, stay connected to you and your body. And that means we start exactly where you are. And maybe if you're numb, or you don't know, or you're pissed off, that we go, how does it feel just to linger there for another moment? It's so small in a way, but even as I say it, I feel nervous almost, because I know how juicy this work is. I go, oh my gosh, right? This is powerful stuff. So these are examples of this process of we're literally growing this new relationship to self. And it can look messy. It can feel really uncomfortable. I think that's the other reality that's important to name, which feels different to me than a lot of the discourse on like self-care, where it can feel like, take care of yourself and like it's a victory lap and just have a voice. And I go, oh my gosh, none of this has felt like a victory lap. It's felt like shit. It's felt disorienting. It's felt confusing and overwhelming, and sometimes terrifying. And you know what? Those are markers that I'm actually heading in the right direction. That's signaling real change. I wrote about it in the book. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Resmaa Menakem's work. He wrote My Grandmother's Hands, which talks about racialized trauma.
I haven't read it, but I read about it in your book. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I use his clean pain versus dirty pain. This chronic fawn response is an example to me of dirty pain. It's like, it feels horrible. We feel stuck. We don't feel okay at all, but it's that familiar day in, day out. Clean pain is what we're talking about right now. This experience of how terrifying it is to tune in and recognize that you don't even know what's there. It's in service of finally moving through to the other side.
And sometimes accessing those emotions, grief you mentioned in the book, I think anger, even that step of telling your therapist that question is annoying is a big step away from fawning. I love it because
big.
Right. Fawning, instead of fawning the therapist, tell them, I don't like that question. I mean, that can be huge for someone.
It is. I can't state it enough. And I think as therapists, if you have a sense that you're working with someone who's a fawner, that's why I say I always go first. I have to make it so safe for this person. It's also why I lead with personal experience. But if I have a sense that they don't like something, I might need to name it first. I might be like, was that awful what I just said? Did you hate that? Yeah, I'll make it really possible for them to be like, well, yeah, I know you meant well, but I didn't really, you have to create the room because they don't feel it in their own body.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're kind of setting the stage to be open to that kind of honesty.
Yes.
Every group has someone who insists on doing things the hard way. That friend still paying for a subscription they forgot they had, the one refusing to update their phone because it still works. If you're that person, especially when it comes to overpaying for wireless, then it's time to switch to Mint Mobile. With Mint Mobile, you will get the same coverage, same speed, unlimited talk, text, and data, just without the inflated price tag of other carriers. And for a limited time, get 50% off 3, 6, or 12-month plans of unlimited premium wireless. There's even a 7-day money-back guarantee. Ready to stop paying more than you have to? New customers can make the switch today and for a limited time get unlimited premium wireless for just $15 per month. Switch now at mintmobile.com/POTC. That's mintmobile.com/POTC. Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Over 50 gigs may slow when network is busy. Capable device required. Availability, speed, and coverage varies. Additional terms apply. See mintmobile.com.
Okay, so one thing as people start to move towards speaking up, perhaps saying no, sometimes setting boundaries. Well, for one thing, when this has been really reinforced over the years, sometimes when you start to step out of this pattern, people do not like it, right? They don't necessarily respond well. Not only that, but sometimes, you can really get a very harsh response to even just setting a small boundary in the beginning. So what are your thoughts about that, right? If you're starting to step into this, but you're getting backlash.
I have so many thoughts. So one is, this is why I say start small, because if you go for the biggie and it does not go well, your body is going to go, I will never let that happen again, right? So we're really building safety, ideally, letting the body know, oh, there's more room for me than I knew there was before. Oh, I do have more flexibility. So I say start really small. I also suggest if you do have a history of unmetabolized trauma, you might need some actual trauma therapy, some reprocessing that needs to happen, because that old material might still be in the driver's seat, and you're just going to reignite it every single time. And so when and where you can, doing the trauma work, I think, is really vital for a lot of people. But I do, to your point, have this line in the book that when we stop people pleasing, people will not be pleased. And I hate that this is true. I wish there was a parade. That's what I feel like we all want right outside our door. Like, you did it. Congratulations. And instead, it's like, who the hell do you think you are? Or, you're being so selfish. Or, to be honest, I'm getting a lot of this feedback even in the press related to the book. They're sort of couching this idea that for people who have never had a self before, to finally inch our way towards having one, they're equating it with not having any empathy and being really selfish. And someone wrote something called, "Isn't this really selfish self-help?" And I was like, boy, you don't get it. You don't get it at all. So people aren't going to like it. And here is my experience, and I've seen this echoed a lot, again, in safe ways and over time. The body feels our different way of taking care of ourselves, having this agency and autonomy that we've never had before. And that feels good. That is that empowered, self-loving, self-esteem having experience that we've been longing for. That is sitting right next to this other experience of like, oh, well, they didn't like it. They didn't appreciate it. So even though you might be experiencing some blowback, I encourage you to look at, but what part of that felt right to you? What do you notice about that newfound empowerment or self-esteem? Can you locate that in your body right now? How do those childlike parts of you feel about you advocating for yourself in this different way? So we're really bolstering this other part of you that's coming online for the first time. And what I've heard so many people say is it boils down to this. I would rather have me in my own life than anybody else. And if having you in my life means I cannot be myself, maybe we're not meant to be in relationship. And so I've seen all of the different possibilities happen. There are the few places where someone finally comes into being themselves, and those old relationships will not tolerate it. And some of those relationships do have to end. But I think what's more common is all of this gray area in the middle where we need a recalibration and a renegotiation. And I often say, maybe even lead with that explicitly. Turn to your friends or your partners or even people at work. You might even say like, wow, I'm learning about this fawn response and how sometimes I reflexively don't show up for myself. And I am a kind person and I have a lot of empathy and I enjoy caretaking, but I don't want it to be my whole personality. So I'm going to be practicing doing things differently. And I want you to know in advance so that you can, see it coming and understand. And I wonder if there are aspects of you that you haven't been bringing your full self into the relationship. Maybe it needs a recalibration in both directions. So I think there are ways to approach this in our safer relationships that can create a lot of room and sort of scaffolding in advance.
Well, and I love this. I think it's almost, there's a bit of a litmus test here.
Yes.
The goal to that person who said this was selfish, the goal isn't to flip it completely and have it be all about you. It's just to have room for
have
both
us
people.
Exist at all. Exactly.
Yeah, and if the other person can't handle that, to me, you try this and you try this recalibration and they can't handle it, you might need to run to get out of this relationship. But sometimes I do think there are relationships that can withstand it, but it's not easy. And sometimes it really rocks the boat. It can really change things fast. And I think the question is like, can the other person handle that? Is there room for you? And you're doing this for a reason, which is that right. You are, you're reclaiming yourself. It's worth it if you want yourself to be able to have a satisfying life. You need to do this for yourself.
And it's in service of more intimacy, more authentic and reciprocal relationship, right? So it's not selfish at all. In fact, it's more selfish, if you're going to couch it in that way, to stay in a chronic fawn response because you're not engaging fully as yourself in the relationship, which means you're not giving the other person to really have their own, their ability to know if they want to stay in relationship with the authentic you or not. And so I actually think it's very loving. It's true intimacy building. It's deeply vulnerable. And I also think it gives other permission to be their full self too. So I think with the relationships that are meant to last, this is gold for both people.
Well, and you yourself are, I think, a ray of hope for people because you found your way through many, perhaps more toxic relationships into better relationships. And you give yourself as an example of this. And I found, especially when people have a history of abuse, emotional abuse, or et cetera, that they don't trust themselves to find a good partner. Either they ignore red flags or they just can't open up to someone. They're too, you know what I mean? They almost like protect themselves so much that they can't develop intimacy. And I mean, I know this is a big question to end on, but when someone maybe has that pattern of, I don't know, dysfunctional relationships over the years, that reenactment pattern, what words of wisdom do you have about building that better, more, I don't know, safe and trusting relationship where you can be authentic?
Yeah. You didn't say it specifically, but you reminded me of that saying that red flags don't look like red flags when they feel like home.
Right. Familiar when they're familiar, right?
That's right. So if all of my sense of safety and survival was built in a context where I literally had to tolerate so much dysfunction, I had to accept it. I had to pivot towards, well, how can I make this intolerable situation a little bit better? And now this is my sort of definition of love, not intellectually, but in my body. This is what I believe to be true. Of course, I didn't see red flags. What red flags? It's all like, well, everybody has problems and there's always going to be a compromise. And so honestly, I think that too is why the personal storytelling is so powerful, because it like drops the curtain to go, well, here's what I was really experiencing. And here's what I was telling myself I was experiencing. And that gives a lot of permission to folks to be like, oh, well, I know this piece over here where, I'm paying everyone's bills and I don't want to be doing that. Or they keep saying they're going to quit drinking or go to therapy. And they keep saying all these pretty words, but there's no behavior behind it. And I keep mistaking the pretty words for some sort of movement there. And so looking at those types of specifics and believing ourselves that it's true is important. I also think noticing your resentments is a really powerful way in of like, well, wait a second. What are you mad about? You haven't found a way to, either have those conversations or really move the needle. What if you just believed yourself that those things that you were upset about were worth being upset about? There is this inherent sort of self-gaslighting. When you're told over and over, it's not that bad. Now we're doing it to ourselves. Well, it's not that bad. It's not that big of a deal. It's going to get better any day now. I call it toxic hope. What if you slowed down and you asked yourself, if nothing changes, if there really is no hope on the horizon, how do you actually feel about the state of things right now? If you weren't dressing it up, if you weren't providing potential solutions that soften the internal blow, you strip all that away. How do you really feel about what's going on? And I think it's just this other opportunity to reconnect with how I really feel in the moment, maybe name it a little more clearly for the first time ever. And even just dipping your toe into that truth for a moment is powerful because the body registered. And then the next time it happens and the next time it happens, it's like you start to collect data in this different way, a different way where we start saying, I matter here. I matter here. This isn't changing. This isn't what I want. I've run circles around it. It's still not moving. Maybe to solve the equation isn't to solve it for them. It's for me to walk away or do it deeply different. And I don't know what else I want to say about that. It just feels like we're giving up, right? That sort of place where you go, but I'm giving up on them. You're not. You're not giving up on yourself one more day.
Yes.
And this is the only place we have any power at all, is our own personal experience.
I think that's so true. If you're doing it with the goal of changing the other person,
right?
You need to maybe take a look at that and think, okay, that's not really what this is about.
Yeah.
Just to really quickly add one thing, you had a reality check from some of your friends, and I think sometimes that can be helpful. Actually, as a therapist, occasionally I have a client say to me, "Does this pattern of behavior sounds normal?"
Yeah.
And when they ask that directly, I feel like I can say, in fact, no, that does not seem normal. Some of the behaviors that people are doing, and I think sometimes when we have that kind of history, it's confusing. And so to check that out and actually speak that, because even telling someone, this is what's really going on here. Does this seem, and I know in the book you mentioned a friend of yours who did that for you. Okay, like, no, you need to get out. Wow.
Yes. Yes. Well, it reminds me too of my husband now. For so long, again, when you're so used to these dysfunctional patterns, and yet it always felt so shocking every time a new thing happened. And I kept turning to him going, can you believe that this happened? Like, oh, I cannot believe. And he finally said, Ingrid, this is the most consistent pattern I've ever seen in my entire life. I literally don't know why you're shocked. Yeah. And I went, you are absolutely right. That part of fawning and even childhood trauma is this numbing, this dissociation. So we're not clocking the ongoing harm. It feels shocking and new every time. So that was a big moment for me where I was like, he's absolutely right. This hasn't changed. And the chances of it changing, not so great. So what do I want to do about it?
Right. Kind of opening your eyes to that. Well, speaking of clocks, I have my eye on ours, and I could talk to you a lot longer about this, but I will just go ahead and refer people to the book to get more of your experience and wisdom and these examples. Really quickly, first of all, thank you again for joining us. And where can people find you online who want to read more about your work?
Everything is on my website, ingridclayton.com. You can find the book Fawning there. I'm on all the social media channels, pretty much Instagram, Substack. My name there is at Ingrid Clayton, PhD, but all those links are on my website. So feel free to come find me there. I let people know I'm not taking individual clients, but I do hope you'll come join the communal spaces and the conversations happening there.
Yeah, there's great community and a lot of wisdom available too. And the book is terrific. So so check it out. We'll link to everything in our show notes. And Ingrid, it was a real pleasure. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I loved the conversation.
Wow, what an interview with Ingrid Clayton. I'm here with Yael to unpack what we just heard, and especially to hear from Yael as a couples therapist in terms of her perspective on this conversation about fawning.
Well, I just have to start by saying this may be my new favorite episode. And I had this thought that not only is this one that I'm going to send to a lot of friends, but this is one that I think all therapists need to listen to, if not read the book, because I think this is just something that comes up so often in the therapy room. And I know so many people who can relate to this. It reminds me very much of the experience of hearing and reading Lindsay Gibson's work on emotional immaturity, which you guys referenced, and we've had Lindsay on the podcast. But if you've had these early experiences that are invalidating and developed coping mechanisms to get through that, and then gotten into adulthood and discovered that those coping mechanisms no longer work for you, I mean, this episode just really speaks to the heart and will make you feel less alone in it. And Lindsay Gibson's work is very similar.
And I tell Ingrid in the conversation, I'll just reiterate that my favorite thing about it is how validating she is about that as a strategy that makes sense. She's not pathologizing about that. And I just love that because I think sometimes we do get so deep into self-blame with these kinds of patterns.
One thing that I'll add that I really appreciate about this episode is the recognition that just because you have developed fawning as a coping strategy doesn't mean that you can't figure out a different path forward once you recognize that it's no longer serving you well. And it got me to thinking about what often happens in the couples therapy room when you have a couple coming in because their dynamic is no longer working. And in the cases where you have one partner who had a really difficult early life experience and has developed fawning as a coping strategy, one of the really powerful things that we actually work on is a strategy that you and Ingrid kind of get into, which is to be explicit about saying, this is a strategy that has been rippling through our relational dynamic for a long time and doesn't feel very healthy. And we're going to try to change that. But it's going to require us to re-choreograph a lot of what we do as a couple, both people. That the person who might be fawning will have to be more assertive, will have to practice saying no, will have to figure out what works for them and what doesn't. And that means that the other person is going to have to hear no, but also get a more authentic partner. So there's much to be gained, but there is a cost to having those gains. But it's really a powerful thing to watch. When couples can navigate that together, they can learn and grow together. Often the person who had been doing the fawning does a lot of healing. And often the person who's on the other side has their own healing to do, right? That they came into this relationship with their own unhealthy relational strategies. And so there's healing on both sides, and there's the opportunity to grow a lot, both as individuals and as a couple. And it's just really a profound transformation that can happen if you have a partner who's willing to do that work with you.
And by naming it and talking openly about the change, I think it's less of a shock. I think sometimes when one person makes a big change in the relationship dynamic out of the blue, seemingly, it really shocks the system and things might unravel a little bit. And maybe that's okay sometimes, but if you're actually talking about it and naming it and preparing the person, maybe it won't be such a shock and just that upheaval that can have when the dynamic changes quickly.
In my writing and in my private practice, I think a lot about people pleasing as a strategy that tends to work sort of very short term and not very long term. But ceasing people pleasing is really hard, both for the person who's doing the people pleasing and for the person who's typically expecting to hear yes. It's an adjustment, but like any relationship, right? When you go through this rupture, repair, repeat cycle. There's growth to be had. Like pretending that everything's okay leaves you stunted, whereas working through what doesn't work is where the growth lies. It's like relational resilience building. I'm going to also mention another thing that I have a lot of thoughts about, which is this topic of hyperattunement. So for people who grew up in sort of precarious, you need to walk on eggshells environments, they often develop this sort of hyperattunement. And in fact, Ingrid talks about this, that she has this hyperattunement and that it works really well in the therapy room. I think a lot of therapists have, it's sort of like the wounded healers concept, that a lot of therapists have had tough childhoods or early experiences that have caused them to build as an adaptive coping mechanism this hyperattunement. And it does really work quite well in the therapy room, but not all the time. And I think it can work quite well in our everyday relational life, but not all of the time. Because the problem with hyperattunement, as I see it, is that because you're constantly scanning the environment, you're interpreting everything and you're often over-interpreting. And what often happens is that you're interpreting neutral cues in a negative direction. So if somebody doesn't say hi to you, are they mad at me? If somebody doesn't respond to an invitation, do they not like me anymore? And that can lead people to do a number of different unhealthy relational strategies, like excessive reassurance seeking or hiding out and refusing to engage because of the fear of rejection. And so part of what happens with the hyperattunement that I just wanted to make note of is that I think on the one hand, we can celebrate it as like a really sensitive relational sensor. And I think that's terrific on the one hand. And on the other hand, for people who have this hyperattunement, it can be really helpful to start to almost take a step back from it and not take it so seriously, to recognize that it is like the smoke alarm that goes off a little too often. And that if you respond to it, it can actually lead to more relationship damage than just kind of sitting on your hands with it.
Yeah, which can be hard to do, to just hold back. This is actually a nice link, I think, between this work and cognitive behavioral therapy, where that idea that you might just jump into an automatic negative thought and you can sort of step back and just say, from the ACT perspective, this thought may or may not be the truth, but it's just a thought and I don't know. Instead of acting as if it's the truth, I need to maybe just pause, hold back, be intentional around how I'm going to respond to it. Because the truth is, a lot of times our minds are wrong. And so, yeah, that's a really good point. And especially when you're hyper attuned to something, then the anxiety kicks in and we might skew a little bit toward assuming the worst.
Yeah. And don't assume that pursuing relationship repair is always helpful. Like sometimes just letting things play out is actually more helpful, because when you pursue reassurance, when you ask people if they're mad at you, when you try to take care of people all the time, it can be irritating, but it can also really lead to a lot of resentment and long-term damage. And so sometimes, even though our brain is telling us like, take action, like danger, social rupture, that the best thing to do is just pause and remind yourself that you're safe in this moment, and that waiting it out can actually demonstrate to your brain and your heart that things are probably more okay than they feel. And that's sort of developing a different relationship to your internal cues.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can easily overdo it with that repair, reassurance seeking, that type of thing. Well, thanks for these insights, Yael. That just adds more to the conversation. There's so much to think about here. And thank you, listeners, for listening to this conversation.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.